our hormones, our metabolic systems, even our blood sugar regulation requires a healthy microbiome. Same thing with our brain. 80-90% of our serotonin, which is the one of the neurotransmitters that's implicated in managing stress, sleep, anxiety, depression, 90% is made by our gut microbiome. But if we have an imbalance, there's no way that your microbiome, your daughter's microbiome, is going to make enough serotonin or GABA or vitamin B12 or acetylcholine, all of these amazing factors that your daughter needs. One of the things that led them down this road might be a history of repeated antibiotics when they were younger. There's a large study in Denmark that looked at antibiotic use in mother-infant pairs and found that antibiotic use in infancy significantly increased the risk, sometimes by up to 50%, of virtually every single mental health disorder by the time those kids were older kids or teenagers. And even from adult studies, we know even just one round of antibiotics can increase the risk of anxiety and depression and mental health concerns. And the more the rounds of antibiotics, the higher the risk.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Integrative Women's Health Podcast. I'm thrilled to be here today with my friend and brilliant colleague and author of this new and fantastic book, Healthy Kids, Happy Kids, Dr. Elisa Song. And as you've heard, she is extremely accomplished. But more importantly, I think she's a busy working mom of kids and now teenagers and has that personal experience as well as deep professional experience. So welcome, Dr. Song.
Oh, thank you, Jessica. I absolutely know the struggles of having the tweens and teens, and so rewarding on so many levels. But yeah, it's a different stage of life, right?
Absolutely. So your book is so focused in the beginning, I think, on the most important thing that we have to help our kids do right now in this age of toxicity, of stress, of excessive device time, less movement time, less outside time. And it's that we're always talking about at Integrative Women's Health Institute, this sort of overlap between the different physiologic systems, nervous system, immune system, endocrine system, digestive system. And you start with some very family and kid-friendly ways to optimize gut or digestive and gut microbiome health. Can you highlight a few of the key hacks for that? Because that's the key to nervous system and immune health as well.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, the first section of the book really goes into for kids and teens and parents who are not yet quite familiar with how important the gut microbiome is for kids, everything. I mean, this is the same holds true for women and for men, right? But just lays down some of the science so that I'm all about educating and empowering kids and teens as well. So I've had teens read sections of the book and have some aha moments of, oh, okay, my skin is not how I want it to be. Wow, maybe I should think about my gut microbiome. So understanding the microbiome immune system connection, the gut brain connection, gut skin, gut hormones, all of that, especially important for our teenage girls and our young women. And so one of the things that I never like to do as a mom is give you just one more thing to do in the day, right? I mean, we're all so busy. And so when I think about creating what I call microbiome magic, it's really with the 5 things that we're already doing every single day. So these are things that I don't want kids and teens or parents to think, oh, it's another thing I have to add on to my to-do list. These are 5 things you're already doing. You already have to eat and drink and breathe and move and sleep. But if we learn how to do them in a microbiome-centric way, in a way that nourishes our microbiome, with the understanding that our microbiome, one of their sole jobs is to keep us healthy and happy, then we can reframe how we're doing those things. So the first chapters 5 and 6 really dive into how do we nourish our microbiome. Chapter 2 is called Breathe, and it's all about how do we engage our vagus nerve to really connect and optimize our gut-brain connection. And then how we sleep, how we move, and how we hydrate all impact our microbiome. And what's fascinating is that each of these things has been shown to optimize our gut microbiome independent, well, we'll take the nourish out, even independent of diet. So
Mm.
how we engage our vagus nerve, and we have mindful moments. We take time to really understand how to breathe with our diaphragm fully instead of up shallow with our shoulders. We take moments to just pause and congratulate ourselves and shift our kind of negative mindset to a positive mindset. All of those things can optimize your gut microbiome diversity and function independent of what we're eating. So for some parents and for some kids, changing diet is one of the hardest, most daunting things. If you are a mom of little kids who are super picky, or even if you have a teen who's super picky, it's stressful. And then as a teen, and you're talking to them about sugar and dyes and all the things that they've heard already, and they give you that eye roll, then all right, well, first just read this part because I want you to understand, why we talk about this thing as a family, but then let's try something different. Right? Let's understand how your sleep affects your microbiome, and how your microbiome, remember, if it's not balanced, that's going to contribute to horrible period cramps, or really, not great skin, or not vibrant, shiny hair. And think about how we're going to nourish your microbiome in all the different ways.
Yes, I love that. And I really like your approach that's more additive. One of the things as a nutritionist, I'm always very careful of with teenage girls and my own daughters is that perspective of restriction, because their bigger risk is disordered eating, right?
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
like, for example, last night I was reviewing your book and we were having dinner, and I said to my 13-year-old, I was like, okay, how many different colors and vegetables and plants and things do we have here? Because you're talking about a really additive
Yep.
approach, like 30 different plants a week or 30 plants. And we counted the plate and it was like 7. So I was like, look, that's not overwhelming if in one meal,
Yep.
having a salad and some roasted zucchini, like you're hitting like a third of what you even need to do
That's right.
practically.
Well, I give a lot of practical tips like that. So one of the things, I mean, we have to know where we're starting from, right? And sometimes, the place we're starting from is most often it's not where we want to end up, right? So we just need to know, without judgment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And many families are pleasantly surprised when they do an inventory like that. Wow, there's actually 7 plants in this dish. I didn't realize that, right? And when we think about plants, well, plants serve as a fuel for your beneficial bacteria, the probiotics in your microbiome. So they help to feed and nourish, act as prebiotics. Now, the what I call microbiome champions, those include the fiber in your fruits and vegetables and legumes and whole grains, but also the color counts too. Each of the different colors of the rainbow provides a different phytonutrient, a different color superpower that actually nourishes our microbiome. And then, of course, we have fermented foods, which have so many benefits beyond just the probiotic content. So if we think about, when we take our plant inventory for a meal, and you just count, no judgment, and you just see. And then one strategy is just to think about, how can I make this meal pop with plants on purpose? And
Mm.
just think about, how do I add just one more plant? Right. So, and that could be a spice. Like if you're cooking with, let's say you're making some roasted bell peppers. Well, when you take it out from the oven, why not, sprinkle some chopped cilantro on it?
Mm-hmm.
Or, add a dash of turmeric on it. I mean, that counts as a plant, right? But if we're not thinking about, well, how do I make it pop? We might not think about what's in our cupboard that I can just have one more thing here. And I've had little kids have so much fun with making it pop, and kind of ask their parents, like, oh, are we making this meal pop too? So really fun. And then, for our teenagers, one of the things that really I think is just so insidious and has crept into sometimes daily life is our sugar-sweetened beverages.
Mm.
So, these boba teas and Starbucks, and it just becomes, what used to be maybe like, oh, on a weekend, let's all go out and we'll get an ice cream sundae, or, have a little a treat, right? But it's become for many kids this after sports practice, oh, we're going to go to Starbucks, get a frappuccino, and it becomes a 3, 4, 5, sometimes 7 day a week habit. And when we think about the number of, the grams of added sugar. Now, I'm not one for, counting and rigorously, because again, we
Yeah.
don't want kids fixated on the exact numbers. But again, when we first do, it's just kind of like, just knowing where you're starting from, do a sugar inventory just to see like how many grams of added sugar is my kid or even me as a grown-up am I having in a day? A
Mhm.
very normal day, right? Don't change anything about it. And most people are going to be really shocked that, wow, I'm having like 3, 4, maybe 5 times the amount of added sugar in a day that I'm supposed to have. For instance, as a woman, we really shouldn't have more than about 25 grams of added sugar in a day. That's about 6 teaspoons of added sugar, right? But when we think about there's one Starbucks mocha frappuccino something drink it has 54 grams of added sugar, 54 grams of added sugar, that's nearly, it's over 10, is it 14 grams of added, 14 teaspoons, right?
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
So if we help our kids think about it in teaspoons, it makes it a little bit easier because we all know what a teaspoon is. We don't necessarily know what a gram is, right?
Right.
And it's not to say never ever any sugar, but it's just for kids to open their eyes and realize, wow, it's just become this part of every day. And it's so much easier to drink, 10 teaspoons of sugar in one sitting than imagining spooning 10 teaspoons
Yes.
of sugar in one sitting. So, and if kids can understand the impact of the added sugars on their microbiome, on their brain health, their mood, their learning, their focus, their skin, it does make it a little easier to say, you know what? Okay, today I really want that boba tea with my friends, but tomorrow I'm going to choose something different. I'll choose
Yeah.
a flavored sparkling water instead, right? So it's all about trying to have that balance.
Yeah, and I've found with my own daughters that that is really key, that there's this sense of agency around choosing things because they will make them feel better and not having to be like 100% of the time, but maybe, like you said, it's more like once or twice a month or once a week we do this, not every single day. And what are the alternatives? I think are so, so helpful.
Well, what you just said is so key, right? So first, just kind of understanding, and just I think for a teenager, one thing that really helps them kind of have that aha moment is when we think about the fact that really from a health and longevity standpoint, we don't want more than about 6 teaspoons of sugar per day for most kids,
Hmm.
and the average teenager today has 34 teaspoons of
Mm.
sugar in a day, right? And so a lot of kids are like, there's no way I'm having 34 teaspoons of sugar. Well, let's just do the math because the food industry is making it so easy, right?
Yeah.
But then it's not enough to stop there because we need to give our teenagers alternatives. We need to
Yeah.
help them understand how to make those swaps so that they can go out and hang out with their friends and, eat with them and drink with them. Yet, if we equip them with the knowledge of how to make different choices, even in that moment. So, like when they go to the grocery store, I mean, my son now, he's 12 and a half, and he's been going downtown with his friends. I mean, started through the pandemic, a way to connect and regroup, and it's continued. So every Wednesday after school. And I mean, sometimes I do cringe at the choices, his friends, and sometimes even he makes. But now one of the most important skills that we can teach our kids and our teens and our young adult children and even ourselves is to learn how to read food labels in a
Mm.
way that we can make these choices that serve our brains and our microbiomes. And so if we teach them how to make these swaps, and in the book I go through, I give an example of, a favorite chip for a lot of my son's friends is Takis, which
Mm.
are these rolled, hot, fiery tortilla chips, right? But if you look at the ingredients, just take a look and you'll see. I mean, one of the first things it says is artificial. So we teach kids, well, what does artificial mean? Why on earth would you want to put something fake into your body, right? So that's one thing. But then if they learn to really assess the ingredients, they can learn how to make those swaps. Or if they're at their grocery store, all right, instead of choosing the Takis, well, if they're at Trader Joe's, okay, the rolled corn tortilla chips, the chili lime ones, are a better option. What's
Mm.
even better is if they're at, Safeway, pick up the bag of Siete Fuego tortilla chips, right? So they can learn how to make these swaps, whether it's the chips or the drinks, right? These hydration drinks that are
Mm.
low sugar, but or no sugar and full of junk like Prime and all of these other things. If they learn how to make a change, it empowers them. It feels like, okay, well, I'm making this decision, and they can also participate in whatever social activities. So, the Prime is another, like that bomb pop Prime hydration drink, or the Gatorade or the whatever. And a lot of these companies, they've moved away from dyes. And they say, dye free and sugar free. So kids think, wow, that's awesome. So you just teach everyone, you never look at the front of the label, you immediately turn it over. And even these artificial sweeteners are really going to wreak havoc on your brain and your microbiome. And so, my son was like, as any typical kid, like, Mom, but I really want it. And I said, well, okay, well, let's take a look and see, can we find other options? Because I didn't know. I mean, we
Mhm.
were in the store. And so, he went to the refrigerated section and he looked at labels. He's like, hey, Mom, how about this? And it was a really cool bottle, a cool can, right? And it was some, I don't know. So it was like a lemonade kind of a drink. And I'm like, okay, let me take a look. So it did have, I think, 4 grams of added sugar. Fine. But nothing else that was terrible. And I looked at the can and it looked really cool. It was actually called Liquid Death. I don't know if
Oh
anybody's ever,
gosh.
I don't know if
Yeah.
anybody's ever seen that, but they're really cool bottles, these cans. And he's like, I would totally love to drink this. And I'd be fine with this over Prime. I'm like, great, me too. Right.
Yeah.
So it's just making it really practical. Once they learn how to do that for themselves, then you can feel confident when they're off to college and making their own choices, or when they're living as young adults, for the first time in their own apartments, cooking for themselves, that they can choose packaged foods and easy foods that still are going to be nourishing.
Yeah, that has been one source of, I guess, positive in my kids. In that my older daughter's now a sophomore, just finished her sophomore year in college, and so she lives with 4 other girls in an apartment, or 3 other girls, and so she had enough cooking skills to like cook dinner for them. They go to the
Mhm.
grocery store once a week. They can live on a grocery budget. They're not constantly eating like fast food and that sort of thing. And it's not to say they never do that, but they have the skill set and she's helping them learn. And, I think we forget that our kids need to learn how to do these things in the
Yeah.
same way they have to learn how to do everything else when they start to be off on their own. So let's circle back a bit to talk about, I think, one of the biggest challenges I see in my patients. We work with a lot of teens and young adult girls girls and women who have endometriosis or pelvic pain or period issues, PCOS, PMDD, this sort of thing. That does track back to the gut microbiome and
Yeah.
in all of those cases, actually, at some level. And I see a lot of anxiety in my teen
Mm.
clients. What are some of the things that we might not be thinking about in terms of medications they may be on, or just habits? Many of them live in very high stress, kind of like high productivity, competitive
Yeah.
kinds of communities, which I know you're not unfamiliar with living in the San Francisco
That's
area.
right.
So, how can we help our teen girls navigate anxiety?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a few things to kind of unpack there. I mean, we know that even before the pandemic, our kids had a mental health crisis. I mean, this is
Mhm.
not a new phenomena. I mean, even before the pandemic, we had suicide has been the top, even, number 2 leading cause of death for our youth. I mean, our 15 to 24-year-olds. Through the pandemic, especially for our teenage girls, that has worsened, unfortunately.
Yeah.
One of the latest numbers, looking at teenage girls specifically, found that around 1 in 3 teenage girls has seriously thought of suicide. 1 in 4 has actually thought of a plan, and 1 in 10 has actually gone on to try. And so, we need to open our eyes to this. And it's not just our teenagers, it goes way down to even, 5-year-olds, 8-year-olds who are in the emergency room
Mhm.
with suicidal ideation. And so I mean, we can think about all the different factors, and of course, there's not never just one factor. If for parents who have read Jonathan Haidt's *The Anxious Generation*, the whole rewiring with our phones and social media, especially for our young women. But if you have a teenage girl or an older, a young 20s, young adult. Daughter, it's not that ship has sailed in terms of, pulling back on the social media and phones, but you can't ungive a phone, at that age,
Yeah.
right? If your child is 8 and they have a phone, I would strongly consider ungiving that if it's a
Mhm.
smartphone,
Mhm.
because there's
Yeah.
just so much data now on the social emotional harms, and it's not just our girls, it's our boys too. In fact, they looked at a group of for boys, it's mostly video games.
Mm.
And found that the microbiomes of kids who game more frequently, more hours, actually, this was college age kids, than fewer hours, had different microbiomes. Now, is it
Wow.
just the games? Probably not. It's probably also the fact that when you're gaming, you're not moving your body, right? And gaming also comes along with a lot of sometimes junk food and chips and just mindless
Snacks.
snacking,
Yeah.
right? So who knows? But it is there, right?
Yeah.
And for our teenage girls in particular, when they're struggling with anxiety and mental health concerns, and they're struggling with horrible skin and period cramps and the PCOS and the endometriosis, we need to step back and recognize that so much of that is really stemming from gut microbiome imbalance. And, we know, for instance, with hormones, right, as your audience is familiar with, our microbiome, if we have, the right balance of microbiome, many of our gut microbes are responsible for how we process our estrogens and,
Yeah.
detoxify and clear and eliminate estrogen, the quote, inflammatory and not the right kind of estrogen. We need a balance, right? Now we know there's nothing that's good or bad. It's just the balance, right?
Yeah.
But our hormones, our metabolic systems, even our blood sugar regulation requires a healthy microbiome. Same thing with our brain. Many listeners have heard that, 80-90% of our serotonin, which is the one of the neurotransmitters that's implicated in, managing stress, sleep, anxiety, depression, perceptive thoughts, right? 90% is made by our gut microbiome if we have the right microbes. But if we have an imbalance, there's no way that your microbiome, your daughter's microbiome, is going to make enough serotonin or GABA or vitamin B12 or acetylcholine, all of these amazing factors that your daughter needs, right? And so when we think about what happens from a conventional model, and there is a time and a place for medications, but we
Mhm.
have to understand the unintended side consequences, right? So for many kids, one of the things that led them down this road might be a history of repeated antibiotics when they were younger.
Mm.
And we know from there's a large study in Denmark that looked at antibiotic use in mother-infant pairs and children, infants, and found that antibiotic use in infancy significantly increased the risk, sometimes by up to 50%, of virtually every single mental health disorder by the time those kids were older kids or teenagers. And even
Mhm.
from adult studies, we know even just one round of antibiotics can increase the risk of anxiety and depression and mental health concerns. And the more the rounds of antibiotics, the higher the risk. So this is in the literature. But why is that? It's because of the disruption of the gut microbiome. So if your child or your teenager is on antibiotics, how many of them are on low dose doxycycline for their acne, right?
Mm.
And they're
Mm.
suffering from anxiety as well, or PCOS, and you have to think, all right, let's have a discussion, with your child. I'm never going to say go off the medications. You want to be supervised by the prescribing physician. At the same time, knowing that if we help support their microbiome while they're on those antibiotics, it can help to balance out so many other things. Now, our teenagers may also be on a lot of other medications that also are known to disrupt the microbiome, like SSRI antidepressant and anti-anxiety medications, right?
Mhm.
Like the birth control pill,
Yeah.
right? Like reflux medications or steroids. So all of these different things can have an impact on the microbiome. And so if your teenager is on multiple of them, they might feel better temporarily, but we often hear, and I often see in the practice, but eventually it stops working. We see that in adults too. The
Yeah.
antidepressant, the SSRI for the first month, maybe even the first year. Okay, it really helped to take the edge off. Great. Sometimes we need that. And then eventually it stops working. But what happens with SSRIs or even birth control pills, it's the disruption to the gut microbiome and also the depletion of important nutrients like your B12 and folate that we need for those neurotransmitters and for healthy detoxification and all of that. So this is not, I mean, I don't want this to sound overwhelming. We just need to know, okay, this is where you're starting from. If your daughter is on these medications, all right, we'll keep them on for now and work on some of the underlying imbalances and potentially some of the underlying root causes so that eventually perhaps they'll be able to wean off some of these medications, or maybe they'll stay on those medications, but they'll have more of a chance that they're going to work for them and that your child will find the relief that they're looking for.
And I think when you meet someone at that level, so if I'm working with someone who has endometriosis and or PMDD and or PCOS, and they are maybe on one or more of these medications, sometimes we actually start with what you were talking about at the beginning, away from food and away from everything else, like starting to learn mindfulness strategies and more physical movement and things that are kind
Yeah.
of additive in a positive way
Hmm.
rather than being like, we have to cut this and stop this and come right off these medications.
Absolutely.
And that can feel overwhelming. Plus, it kind of pulls the rug out of from under people because a lot of times they're using food for some emotional support, for some social connection. And so I think if we can start looking in those other parts of those five things you were talking about, the movement and connection, it gives people like a rug to stand on
Hmm.
before we start slowly taking away the medications as they need them less and less.
Well, and I also, I think one of the things with starting with the mindfulness piece and with the connection piece is I think that is one of the most important foundations, one of the most important life skills that we can, give to our teenagers, our young. I mean, starting from the time they're toddlers and like so
Hmm.
frustrated with the thing, right? Um, and as we support our children and our teens in that way, I also really emphasize that this is not a woo-woo kind of optional concept, right?
Yeah.
I make it very concrete because our teenagers now, they are super savvy. They are looking stuff up and they're bringing research to me and they're having you know sometimes frustrating conversations because they're but they're great opportunities to teach them about um, the source of the information, you're right, that they're getting some ideas from, and also how to read research papers with a more of a critical eye. So I love these opportunities, and I love kids to have that inquisitive, questioning mind, and they're being taught that in school, which is great. But
Yeah.
that means there's on some level a little less tolerance for fluff, right? And we've
Yeah.
seen this through the pandemic, right? Where's the science? Follow the science. I want the evidence. And I can barely post something on Instagram without someone saying, "Well, I'd like the resources," right? And it's like, great. And
Yeah.
yet, if we don't know how to be savvy about, reading the resources and really mm, making it our own, it sometimes is not as helpful. But when we talk about vagus nerve, when I talk about vagus nerve and the power of, mindfulness, I put it into, very clear, more scientific terms and let them know, look, when we're working on our vagus nerve, we know that one of the best predictors of current and future health is how well your vagus nerve is functioning, is how
Yeah.
optimal something called heart rate variability is, which some teenagers are familiar with because they're using their Whoop to track their exercise or they're really into athletics and they can see, oh, or even my Apple Watch tracks something called heart rate variability. Well, it is so important. And um, when we think about the benefits of optimizing your heart rate variability and working, giving your vagus nerve some muscles, what I tell kids and teens and parents, is that, the effect of feeling calm and focused and in the zone. I love that. I want everyone to feel that. That to me is an amazing side effect. The real
Yeah.
benefit is what's going on underneath with reducing chronic inflammation, regulating your immune response, balancing your hormones, regulating your blood sugar, managing your stress response, all of that. And so, when kids and adults recognize that, psychological stress can um, also directly cause leaky gut and trigger microbiome imbalance and create as much inflammation as any infection or environmental toxin or physical injury, then we can place vagus nerve work up on one of our most important prescriptions. And that is
Yeah.
something, as kids go through life and as we as adults go through life, that's something that we can learn how to do every single day, really at no cost, right? It's not an extra supplement. It's not saying, oh, and we don't have to buy the next fancy, vagus nerve device. It's like you might need that to start with. And certainly I've had kids use, some vagus nerve devices to just more passively learn what it feels like to engage your vagus nerve because they're just so much in the sympathetic all the time. But
Yeah.
once we learn how to engage our vagus nerve, you can do that anywhere, anytime. And it really is the key to um, getting well if you have some health concerns. It is also the key to staying well because I know that many people have had the experience as grown-ups. I see this in my practice with kids where, we get them well. They're quote in remission, and then maybe 6 months down the road, a year or 2 later, things start to come back, right? Because we haven't changed one of the core, factors that helps regulate our inflammatory response and ultimately, our health outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that how we do that in terms of, kids, as you say, they like gadgets. Now we do the same thing. We track HRV with Garmin or a Ring, Whoop,
Yep,
Apple
yep.
Watch, whatever they have, or whatever we give to them. And then they can see the power of things that otherwise feel a little bit woo woo, like you said, like whether it's you talk in the book about acupressure and
Mhm.
acupuncture and homeopathy, which I find very powerful for teen girls with both anxiety and menstrual
Yeah.
symptoms, and honestly, hot flashes, one of the best things
Yeah.
for
Oh, yeah.
perimenopause. Um, but also things like essential oils or petting dogs or nature exposure or the breath work. Like these are, I think, an important skill set that people should be learning as kids and practicing and evolving and using because you're right. When that neuroendocrine, neuroimmune coordination of the vagus nerve from the brain and the nervous system to all of the systems is not maintained. And I've been talking about this kind of with people our age who remember sort of pre when our communication was not always just like texting and
Mhm.
social and like Snapchat and things like that, but you actually would like sit on your friends and next to your friends and like chat. Like when I was in grad school, we used to get together and like watch Grey's Anatomy and like lay on the floor and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
when people have this like stress that, we have that bucket theory for toxins, right? Like if there's too much in the bucket and you can't release it, it's like gets overflowing.
Yeah.
But I think of stress as like a tire being full of air. And then we used to just let the air out a little bit at a time with chit chatting with a friend or we used to like run the stairs for exercise, but we'd be talking the whole time. Or, you'd be kind of like laying with your friends and just not even like, you wouldn't even have to be touching, but there's just sort of this like restful position where you just like
Yeah.
let go of a little stress, a little stress. And we do that now more officially with like trauma release shaking exercises, which are great. But it's like we used to just do that a lot all the
Yeah.
time.
It's true.
And
And
we've lost some of that. The kids don't just ride their bikes to their friends where they would kind of like get a 2-minute blowing off of steam in a way that we used to have all the time. Does that make sense?
It absolutely. And, here's the thing. We know, even through the pandemic, the power of community and how
Mhm.
social isolation one of it's a big risk factor
Yeah.
for decline later in life. And so with this, grand social experiment with these cell phones now that are ubiquitous, and we've never had any, long-term studies on brain development and social emotional and immune and physiologic outcomes. There are more coming, right? But unfortunately, for many of our teenagers, they're kind of right in the middle of this
Yeah.
this experiment, right? But one of the larger studies that looked at screen time use and found that any screen time use did actually significantly increase depression and even suicidal thinking. Anything over more than 5 hours was a big jump, right? And our kids, and even us as adults, if you look at your screen time use, many are well above 5 hours. And a lot of kids think there's no way it's 5 hours. But you know what? Now it's this, when it's waiting to get into the school doors, right? If the doors are locked,
Yeah. It's
instead of just sitting there
always, yeah.
hanging, chatting, you're like on the phone, right? I mean, these kids are there not communicating and talking. Or if you're waiting for, to get your school lunch and you're waiting in line, instead of, again, just sitting there chatting, hanging out with whoever happens to be next to you, everyone's on their phone. So it's we're grabbing minutes at a time that all add up, even as adults, right?
Oh, for
And
sure.
and
Yeah.
in this study, what they found, there were some things that were actually protective, because it's not enough to say, oh, it's causing all this harm. We need, as moms, proactive, positive measures. That's why I'm all about solutions and hope. I mean, we don't want to just be all doom and gloom. So one of the most important factors was in person communication, right? Face
Mhm.
to face communication. And so, like you said, just hanging out, like just sitting on a park bench, just like gabbing, or even maybe not just even gabbing all the time, but just having a moment together, right? So face to face. So that was one. Another one was being on a sports team. That's
Mm.
community as well, right? It's also
Yeah.
moving your bodies and all of that, right? The third one was really interesting because this study is a little bit older, but the third one was reading print news, which I'm like,
Oh,
who
okay.
who picks up, a journal now? But I mean, I love it, right? I love when I'm at
Yeah.
the airport and I pick up a magazine and I'm like, oh, I'm flipping through and I'm actually reading something in my hands. That's why, I mean, sure, I have books on Kindle that are easy to transport, but there's nothing like holding a book in your hands and actually reading it.
Yeah.
So anyhow, those were the three factors. But I think the more face to face, and even with boys too, it's the communication that is what is so important. And as we think about the other factor, I think nowadays, with stress is, many of us, and our kids, by that same token, have really lost a lot of our stress tolerance, right? And
Mm.
what I mean by that is, for many kids, and teenagers, when I ask them, they expect that, stress and anxiety is just a part of life. And, oh, so-and-so is on medications. Of course, I'm going to be on medications, and view every single setback, anxious moment, stress as really bad. Oh my gosh, I'm
Mm.
so stressed, right? It's like, well,
Mm.
stress is, as we think about it, and that's why I spent some good chunk of time in the book just really explaining that stress is really, it's a physiologic response. It's just your body's
Right.
response to getting ready for something, right? Whether, I mean, in the past it was that saber-toothed tiger, right? But now it's like, okay, getting ready for a test, or getting ready to get up and go in the morning, or getting ready for whatever, right? So stress in and of itself is not a quote bad thing all the time. And in our quest to have no stress, be happy all the time, avoid, just make life really easy for our kids, we've inadvertently, unfortunately, lost many opportunities to continually build up stress resilience. And so when a
Yeah.
bigger stress comes along, it's like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to handle it, because I've never had to deal with the frustration of, um, I mean, this is a small example, but like my daughter, when she forgot her recorder for her school, the elective, and then she was in 6th grade. And so we were at school dropping her off. She's like, "Oh my gosh, I forgot my recorder." She's like crying. And I was like, I wanted to go back home and get the recorder, but I couldn't. I was late to work. And I'm like, "I'm sorry, honey." Right. And so, but guess what? She never forgot her recorder again.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
little things like that. Like you
Yeah.
just and guess what? She survived not having her recorder, right? And
Yeah.
feeling like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe I forgot that, and I'm just gonna have to sit here, do something different while all my friends are playing the recorder." All right, but she managed, right? And so then
Yeah.
the next time she's like, "All right, I'm not gonna forget." And it wasn't the end of the world like I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, I think that's such a key skill we've got to help these kids learn in middle school. I mean, my daughter too, like anytime her friend was mad at her, or she was having some kind of social disagreement, it was as if like forever, like life is over.
Yeah,
And so many, many times we had to be like, well, remember, this has happened before and you're going to be friends again in a couple days. She's feeling upset right now. But because they're so immediately all the time connected, it's like if they don't get that dopamine hit of the right kind of text or the right kind of
yeah,
connection, you're right, they have to practice the skill set of being frustrated, having discomfort, being embarrassed is huge.
yeah,
But I have seen now, having, for giving parents some hope, I have seen now with my daughters in, 8th grade, and having done that now with a lot of practice and discomfort for me as the
yes,
parent and
yes,
the
for
mom,
sure.
is that, but it's our instinct, as you said, to try to like make it easier for them. But if I can sit there and tolerate her discomfort while she's feeling that way, it actually teaches her this resilience. And now 2 years later, we're seeing much more self resilience. But I think it's hard as parents when you're like, okay, never mind, I'll fix it. I'll go home. I'll change my day. I'll bring the recorder. But if we don't do that again and
Yeah,
again and again, it does teach them they have that strength.
yeah.
So, well, before we wrap up, I do want to talk about one other thing that you address briefly in the book. So, you talk about the most common things that kids have. And the top one is like the crud, right? So that's like any virus
Yes,
and
any junk, right, that we go through.
any viral infection, any sometimes a bacterial infection. And so for me, though, having had this deep and educational experience
Yeah,
with COVID and long COVID, I know a lot about COVID, and I'm sure you do too, just being in a primary care practice. So we now see that the data shows that COVID is different from the other crud well, not in everyone, but in a pretty high percentage of kids. Somewhere between 10 and 40% of kids will go on with each COVID infection to have long COVID. And we know, for you and I in functional medicine, functional nutrition, integrative medicine, we know that it's not wildly different from all of our other post-viral,
mhm,
post-infectious syndromes, like post-Lyme or Epstein-Barr, things like that. But for kids, so I've actually recently been working with a couple of teen boys, and I don't see a lot of men and boys. I mostly see girls and women, as you would guess. But boys with pretty significant long COVID. And the biggest challenge I have there, and I'm wondering what you're doing in your practice, is because long COVID, it's a series of things. It's mast cell activation syndrome, it's
yep,
dysautonomia, it's ME/CFS, but the intense chronic fatigue and the chronic pain and the like instability of the organ systems and the viral persistence, these kids, like with adults, I can help them go from like, okay, you're so debilitated, we have to be patient, we have to sit with the discomfort while we're healing, we have to take these little baby steps to retrain the nervous system
mhm,
that you're safe and you're healing. A lot of vagus work, a lot of gut healing work. But it's hard because when I explain it to my adult clients, it's like you're going to eventually get on this upward spiral of healing. It's not the upward straight line of healing, it's like up and down.
yeah,
But with teens and kids like that are so sick, how do you get them started on that? Because it's like their parents, how can they do it? How can their families do it? They get really stuck with such intense symptoms.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the fortunate thing is, at least in the younger population, I mean, rarely have I seen long COVID. And I
Mm.
think for at least in my population, um, the one of the biggest shifts in terms of when you have the crud or when you're getting sick is from a natural, integrative pediatric standpoint. You want to jump on things right away, right? There's
Mhm.
no kind of, oh, let's wait and see symptoms. No, I mean, if you're starting to get a little sniffle or a sore throat or a headache or whatever it is, and you know there's something going on, you don't know exactly what, well, you jump on it. And I give, recommendations. I mean, there's an African bush herb called pelargonium, which is great. You add up your vitamin D. There's some great homeopathics to take. So for a lot of my kids, they just get over things very quickly. Right. But then, the long COVID is more common in the teenage population. And I've one kiddo right now he's headed off to college. He was a competitive baseball player. And I think, for adults and for our teenagers who are go, 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 it's also, I mean, little kids have the time to just sit and sleep and miss school and recover and, do all the things that it takes. But when we don't, we know how, I guess the right word would be toxic, mitotoxic, the SARS-CoV-2 virus is, what a strain it puts on
Mhm.
your mitochondria, that if we're not supporting mitochondrial recovery, we're not going to help with immediate recovery, right? And so
Yeah.
I always check mito markers for kids. With our kids, like I'm just thinking about this one kiddo in particular, I try to work with the main symptoms and try to give a quick little win at first, right? And so for him, it was the fatigue after practice because he was still practicing, right? I mean, he's headed like professional baseball route, right? And
Yeah.
so just at first, just really piling on the adrenal and the mitochondrial supports to give him a little bit more energy, a little more hope that okay, I can get a little bit better, right? And then it's just unraveling, trying to do the research and figuring out what is the element of mast cell activation. We did a lot of vagus nerve work. And for teenagers, this is where some of the passive work really is more helpful. So whether it's with I don't have any stock in any of these companies, but an Apollo Neuro or a True Vega, we did red light therapy for him. Got a big panel, which really really helped him. He could feel his recovery after exercise improve immediately after starting the red light panel. And so
Did you
just trying to
use like the lower, what do you remember what the frequency that you used, like 660? Was it lower or
It was
higher?
lower. It was
Lower.
lower.
Yep.
Yep.
Mhm.
And then I think he was there for maybe 15, 20 minutes. And so
Yeah,
his
like
dad
once a
his dad
day or every other day, something like
Yep, we
that.
started
Mhm.
every other day and then we did,
Mhm.
once a day. Um, and again, for teenagers, hard to be as consistent, right? But when they see that there's benefit, it's a little bit more empowering. I mean, I think his dad used the red light more than him eventually, right? Because his dad felt so good with it, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's understanding also. I think that for many people who, as you said, a lot of people with long COVID are the ones who are the higher performing, just on the go, 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 used to being at the top of their game, all the time. And so it's really giving yourself that grace to know, you know what, like getting really sick and needing time to recover doesn't mean there's anything wrong with me. Like I'm not like lesser of an athlete or whatever, because of this, and not blaming yourself. Because I think in the beginning of COVID, it was a weird time. It was
Oh, for
just a
sure.
strange time, right? But now we know, okay, everyone is going to respond differently, sometimes surprisingly. But I do think, for patients, if you can really allow yourself the time and the space instead of just go, go, go and thinking, okay, I'm just gonna get over this at some point, your recovery is gonna be put on a path of healing a little bit more quickly.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. My experience is the same. The kids I'm seeing, teenagers, are high performing, most are athletes. We're used to being very healthy, very fit, very active, very cognitively on
Yeah.
top of it. And, we know COVID can live in the body actively reproducing for up to, well, the studies are more than 2 years old now, and they're still seeing it.
Yeah.
So, in a way, what's going on is the immune system hasn't been able to find and clear all of it in as long as it takes. And as you said, along the way, it's like causing all this damage, mitochondrial and immune and vagal. And so I think it's a useful tip for parents and especially the kids who are feeling really hopeless, that to know that you will recover. And I actually do believe that at this point, having experienced this myself, although it might take a couple of
Yeah.
years even, but
Yeah.
kids are more, you know, pliable, if you will.
Well, yeah,
And
there's less to mop up from
yeah.
before, right?
Yeah.
So,
But it is the ones that are really used to achieving that are very high achieving athletes that it makes it so hard to slow them
it's
down.
really hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it's just like, for kiddos who, have, let's say, sprained their ankle, right? And they
Mhm.
wanna get right back on. I'm like, "You know what? You will get back on the field faster for longer if you give your ankle time to fully heal. Because otherwise,
Yeah.
you go right back out, injured again, and then you're out for another couple of weeks. You go back, you injured again, maybe you injure it worse, and then now you're out for the whole season, as opposed to taking the time to fully heal, and then at least you can go back at least for part of the season, full force and ready to go. The other population of kiddos that can have trouble with COVID is our kids who already have PANS or PANDAS, or sometimes
Mm.
develop like a PANS type picture, even if they didn't have it before. So I,
Yeah.
I also look really closely at the neuropsychiatric symptoms that can arise. In the early days, these neuropsychiatric symptoms were not associated with COVID. And so, after many case reports and now recognizing that for kids and teens having these, sudden onset of anxiety or OCD or eating restriction or cognitive decline and handwriting decline and all of that, very similar to a PANS picture, that COVID can absolutely be a trigger. Or if your kids already have PANS, already have immune dysregulation, then they can have a flare in their symptoms with COVID infections. What's interesting is I don't see that with all of my PANS kids. So, I'm
Mhm.
trying to figure out, well, what is the difference there? Like, which kids are the ones who are going to flare and which kids aren't? But just being really attuned to that, because for some parents they don't necessarily um, recognize that maybe some of the mood changes that are lasting a little bit longer, after the other symptoms go away, like the physical symptoms go away, or just maybe a little slower thinking, and they're forgetting some of their math concepts that they
Yeah.
were so on top of, right? That could be COVID related.
Yeah, absolutely. That's super helpful insights. I think parents, certainly with kids with long COVID, the kids themselves, but the parents for sure just need these little sprinkles of hope, because the reality is that there's not a lot. And, even the conventional long COVID centers don't have this mindset of how to fully recover, and it can be really devastating.
Yeah.
So, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for writing this fantastic book. Everyone, go
Yay.
get this. If you have kids, you definitely need this book. I mean, there's
Yeah,
so
or
many
grandkids.
resources.
I have a lot of grandparents that are loving kind of redoing their pantry for their kids and
Yeah.
thinking about,
Yeah.
what treats they wanna give them that are actually nourishing their grandkids too.
That's fantastic. So, thank you for this. Thank you for your work. And thank you for being here today to share all of this with our community. And let me know where they can find you.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. I love chatting with you, and as we were saying before we started, it's been way too long, so
I
I hope to
know.
see you in person soon. You can find me on my website, healthykidshappykids.com, and also I'm most active on Instagram, and that's healthykids_happykids.
Great. All right. Thank you, Dr. Song. Thank you so much, everyone. And we'll see you next week.